My name is Jacob Owens. I'm 45 years old and I've served in the United States Army for nearly a quarter of a century. I've worn this uniform longer than some of the men in that briefing room have been alive. And yet, sitting in that cold steel chair, staring across the long table at a young man waving around a laser pointer like it was a sword, I felt more invisible than I ever have in my life. Brandon McNeil, the new base commander, was pacing back and forth like he'd owned this place for decades. He was polished, fresh, and full of ideas. The son of a retired general, he walked in with the kind of confidence only inherited power brings. He spoke of innovation, realignment, and cutting inefficiencies. I sat there, hands folded, lips sealed, watching him dismantle slide by slide the very foundation I'd spent most of my adult life building. It wasn't that I didn't understand progress. It was that he didn't understand legacy. He was too busy showing off charts to notice the eyes of the men who had actually fought to make this base what it is. Guys like me. I joined when this place was little more than a stretch of dirt and broken fencing. No barracks, no real command structure. Just potential. I poured my time, my sweat, and parts of myself. I'll never get back into shaping this base into a fully operational command post. We trained young soldiers here. We ran joint force simulations and hosted foreign dignitaries. I drafted protocols still used in NATO briefings, and yet today my name wasn't even mentioned in the overview of the base's history. Brandon kept talking like the world began the day he walked in, like none of us mattered anymore. There was a moment halfway through his presentation when he clicked to a slide that showed a new organizational chart. My name had been moved. No explanation, no warning. A little line now placed me under someone 10 years my junior with no field command experience. I felt my stomach tighten, but I said nothing. I've learned that the more you speak in moments like these, the more they stop listening. As he rattled off his vision for modernization, I caught sight of a few younger officers nodding along. They didn't know the cost of the stability they now took for granted. They didn't know about the winter of 2009 when a supply chain collapse nearly shut down our operations, and I drove through 3 counties myself to secure medical shipments. Or the time we intercepted a cyber threat from a rogue contractor because I personally double-checked the back-end system logs. They knew none of it, and yet here I sat silently erased. I glanced around the room. Familiar faces looked just as weary. These men knew who I was. They'd served beside me in more than just boardrooms. Some of them had seen me carry wounded during the Fort Raleigh crisis. Others had watched me hold the line during those tense nights after a base breach. I didn't need applause, but I deserved better than silence. As Brandon wrapped up his pitch, I watched him lean into the edge of the table with a satisfied grin. He didn't look at me. Not once. I suppose he thought ignoring me was the easiest way to move forward. I didn't flinch, didn't show the sting, but inside something shifted. I'd seen change before, but this felt different. This wasn't evolution. This was erasure. And while the room began to empty, and the sound of boots echoed down the hallway, I remained seated for just a moment longer. Not because I was unsure what to do, but because I knew I'd just witnessed the start of something. Something I couldn't yet name. But I felt it. Like the first tremor before the storm. I rose slowly, collecting the scattered notes I knew no one would read. As I stepped into the corridor, the distant noise of drills and orders called out from the motor pool. The base was still breathing, still alive. But something had broken today, and I wasn't sure if anyone else had noticed, or if they even cared. The walls in that room were too clean, too bare. Just a seal on the wall behind Brandon's head, and a table between us that felt more like a barrier than furniture. He didn't sit. He stood pacing a little, like he was rehearsing lines from a play he didn't quite believe in. I stayed seated still in uniform. Still technically his superior in field experience. But that didn't seem to count for much anymore. He started by thanking me for my service, which I knew was the prelude to something sharp. Then came the language: alignment, optimization, streamlined readiness. He spoke in a tone that sounded polite, but carried the cold edge of finality. He told me my command role was being reassigned as part of a new structural initiative. I would be placed into an advisory position under the Strategic Development Office focused on legacy operations. Legacy. That word clanged in my ears like a closing gate. It was a word you used when something was no longer needed, but too awkward to throw out. A museum piece. I stared at him for a moment, trying to find even a flicker of doubt in his expression. Nothing. Just that same corporate poise dressed up in camouflage. I asked him if this was permanent. He said it was for the good of the mission. Said younger officers needed room to lead. That my depth of knowledge would be better utilized as a historical touchstone. He said it with a straight face, like I was a footnote in a field manual, not a man who had bled for this place. I nodded once. That was all. No anger. No raised voice. Just a quiet nod. But inside my chest was tight. It felt like he'd cut something vital with a single sentence. All those years, all that sacrifice, reduced to a bullet point on his reorg presentation. I didn't trust myself to speak right away, so I just stared at the table for a moment, gathering what little pride hadn't been scorched by his words. He went on, as if filling the silence would make the transition feel smoother. He mentioned something about AI integration, about data-driven command models. He actually said the words force evolution curve. I wanted to laugh, or maybe shout, but I did neither. Instead, I asked one thing: if I could have a copy of my original commission papers and the personnel restructure document. He looked caught off guard by that. Nodded, said he'd make sure HR delivered everything. That was when I stood. Slow, even. I offered a salute. He returned it. But I could see he wasn't used to saluting someone like me, someone who'd earned it the hard way. As I stepped out of that room, I didn't feel angry the way people expect. I felt carved out, like something had been taken quietly and without ceremony, but not gone, just sleeping. I made my way back to my quarters, the hall suddenly feeling unfamiliar. I wasn't sure what I'd do next, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. I closed the door to my quarters with more force than I meant to. The sharp click of the lock echoed behind me, but the silence that followed felt different this time. Not the kind of silence that wraps around you in peace, but the kind that waits for you to remember who you really are. I walked over to the old metal filing cabinet in the corner. The thing was dented, scratched, and heavy, like the years it held inside. I hadn't opened that drawer in ages. Most days I barely looked at it, but something inside me knew exactly where to start. My hands moved without hesitation, flipping through thick folders marked with dates and stamps. Old evaluations, training reports, deployment orders. And then I found it. My original contract from 2003. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still sharp. My name was there in bold black type. Jacob Owens, Colonel Strategic Operations. I sat down slowly, scanning the pages like a man searching for breath underwater. And then I saw it. Section 14.3. Compensation Clause. It had been my idea back then. A small percentage, just 1% of all future strategic training contracts that used the Owens Doctrine. They said yes at the time because they didn't think it would matter. Just a footnote in a sea of documents. But it had never been revoked. Never amended. Just buried. That one clause was my fingerprint on every training initiative this base had launched since 2005. And now, with the new modernization contracts flooding and that 1% could be worth more than any severance package, Brandon thought he could slide across a table. I sat back, letting the quiet settle again. This time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like potential. They thought they were pushing me aside, replacing me with something cleaner, newer, flashier. But they didn't know what I still held. I folded the contract carefully, slid it into a folder, and placed it on the desk. The game wasn't over. Not even close. The folder creaked as I opened it, the thick manila edges curling from age. I flipped past my contract, pulling out documents I hadn't looked at in years. Among them was the 2018 amendment, the one Brandon used to fast-track international training expansions. He had paraded it around like his personal crown jewel. I had skimmed it back when it passed, but never looked closely. Tonight, I did. My fingers paused on the signature page. 4 names. 2 of them looked off. The slant of the ink, the pressure on the paper. I'd seen these signatures in enough command briefings to recognize when something didn't sit right. I pulled out old sign-in logs and scanned documents from the same month. The pieces lined up too neatly, or rather not at all. 2 of those officers had been overseas on classified deployment when that paper was allegedly signed. A chill moved through me, slow and heavy. This wasn't a clerical error. This was fraud. And not just sloppy fraud, deliberate paper, deep cover your tracks fraud. Which meant every contract built on this amendment, every multi-million-dollar deal Brandon had bragged about, was legally worthless. All of it could collapse with a single verified fact. And I now had that fact in my hands. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the papers as if they had just spoken aloud. This wasn't just leverage. This was structural weakness. Brandon had built his empire on sand, and he never stopped to check the foundation. But I had. I'd always kept the receipts, always understood that details win wars. He thought I was a relic. What I really was quiet. I gathered the forged amendment, the logs, the supporting records. This wasn't anger anymore. This was precision. A calm, steady hand ready to place a single weight where it would do the most damage. They didn't just underestimate me. They ignored the one man who knew exactly where every bone was buried. And now I was digging. I didn't make a move right away. That would have been too easy. Too loud. I knew men like Brandon. They moved fast, talked big, and rarely looked over their shoulder. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence is where patience breeds power. So I waited. Every morning I scanned the defense updates like I was back in recon. Names. Approvals. Funding cycles. I tracked a breadcrumb trail until I saw it. A headline buried halfway down a Pentagon memo. Proposed multi-year doctrine adoption. Total value estimated at $300 million. The ink hadn't dried yet, but I recognized the framework. It was mine. The Owens Doctrine, they still called it that. My name, my structure, my training model. Tweaked, yes, but the bones were mine. And the funny thing about bones is that when you break the foundation, everything else crumbles. I kept reading, following the chatter. Brandon's name was getting louder. He was being credited as the architect behind the deal. That was fine with me. They were celebrating a win built on contracts I authored. Contracts tied to a clause they forgot. Contracts reinforced by an amendment that didn't legally exist. I didn't need to make noise. I just had to let them believe they'd won. Let them smile for the cameras and shake the right hands. Let them trap themselves. In the background, I quietly gathered confirmations, financial trailings, internal memos with Brandon's signature next to my doctrine's name. I made copies, encrypted backups, sent sealed envelopes to 3 trusted colleagues. If anything happened to me, that information wouldn't disappear. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. The days passed slow but steady. I watched from the shadows as Brandon toured bases, gave speeches, recorded messages about legacy and innovation. He thought he was untouchable, but I knew where the floor would give out. The moment they pushed that contract across the table in D.C., everything would be tied to me. I could almost hear the sound of the trap clicking shut. He walked right into it. I didn't have to shout. I just had to wait for gravity to do its job. The arrogance of youth isn't just loud, it's blind. And he never once looked down. But I did. The cursor blinked on the screen like a heartbeat. I typed slowly, each word measured, deliberate. The email wasn't long, just enough to raise the right kind of questions. I addressed it to the Department of Defense Legal Division, flagged it confidential, and attached scanned copies of the forged 2018 amendment. I included deployment logs, officer statements, and a timeline showing where every signature went wrong. No drama, no accusations, just facts. I hit send and sat back, letting the silence settle again. An hour passed before I saw the first ripple. The contract status moved from active to pending review. Then came the phone calls I didn't answer and the emails I didn't need to read. By evening, defense news sites were buzzing. Words like oversight and discrepancy started floating around. And beneath those, a colder word: fraud. Brandon hadn't seen it coming. His calendar was full of briefings, interviews, prep meetings for the contract announcement. And now it was all falling through his hands. He had no idea the blow had already landed. I didn't need to watch him scramble. I already knew what that kind of panic looked like. Tight jaw, rapid blinks, desperate damage control. This wasn't revenge. It was exposure. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't stormed in. I had simply turned on the light and let the truth speak. Let the system see what it had overlooked. And now it was listening. Every file they opened told the same story. A story they thought had been buried. But I had kept the receipts. And now they were reading them, line by line. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and panic. Brandon sat at the head of the table, his jacket-off shirt collar tugged open like he was already unraveling. I walked in without a word, briefcase in hand, and let the silence do the talking. He tried to smile, but it barely held. His eyes darted to the folders in my hand like they were loaded weapons. I sat across from him and laid out the first folder. Forged amendment. Missing signatures. Dates that didn't line up. I pushed it toward him without a word. The second folder followed. A timeline of every training deal tied to the bogus document, 6 years of violations, stacked in black and white. And the third, my favorite, was the 2003 contract with the clause they forgot. 1% of all training revenue based on my doctrine. He blinked hard, like trying to erase what he was seeing. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers, but he didn't open them. He didn't have to. I leaned in slightly and gave him the number. 12 million. Paid in full. Quiet settlement. My silence in exchange for his survival. His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. The shift was complete. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. His voice cracked as he tried to say something conciliatory. I didn't need his apology. I needed him to understand that the man he dismissed had built the very walls now closing in on him. I stood as he nodded weakly. The deal was struck. I left with my head high and no need to look back. The final meeting took place in a quieter room, smaller, more private. No suits. No flag-draped stage. Just Brandon, his lawyer, and a folder holding the terms he'd finally agreed to. $9.5 million. Less than I asked, but more than enough. I looked at the number, then at the man who once called me obsolete. His eyes never held mine. He looked past me into some middle distance where his reputation still had a pulse. I opened the folder, read every word, even though I knew it by heart. The non-disclosure clause was tight. My language. My conditions. No spin. No hero story. Just silence. He slid a pen across the table. I picked it up without hesitation. Each signature felt like a release valve opening. I signed, closed the folder, and pushed it back. It was done. The fight that began with a quiet demotion ended with a quiet deal. No cameras. No press. Just closure. Brandon stood, extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was limp, uncertain. He muttered something that might have been thank you or maybe sorry. I didn't ask. I didn't care. The past had no weight left in my hands. As I stepped out of that building, the sun hit a little different. The base behind me looked smaller than it used to. For 20 years, it had been my second skin. Now, it was just another structure. Brick and concrete. Not a home. Not anymore. I didn't feel triumphant. Just clean. Like rinsing off years of mud and duty. Power isn't about control. It's about choice. And for the first time in a long time, I had it again. I chose to walk away, not because I lost, but because I'd already won. Freedom came with no uniform. No title. Just peace. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was free. Let them keep the base. Let them run their doctrine. I had reclaimed something far more valuable. Myself. And that was worth every word I never had to say. The bar hadn't changed much. Same scratched wood counters, same soft hum of low conversation and old country songs bleeding from the jukebox. I sat at the far end, a glass of bourbon in front of me, watching dust float through shafts of light. It felt like I'd been here yesterday, though it had been years. Back then, I came here with boots muddy from drills and a head full of orders. Now I had no rank to carry. No clock to race. Just silence. I sipped slow, let the burn settle in my chest, and watched life pass by outside the window. People walked fast like they had somewhere urgent to be. I didn't envy them. I had nowhere to be, and that was a kind of wealth you couldn't earn with medals or contracts. I'd spent so long proving I belonged in that world, fighting for respect, for legacy, for a seat at a table where I was always one reform away from being erased. But now, none of it mattered. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel left behind. I just felt done. Done chasing. Done defending. Done holding on to things that no longer held me back. And as I sat there, letting the last of the bourbon, I didn't need the base. I didn't need the uniform. I had my name. I had my story. And that was enough. So let me ask you something. When the fight is over and the noise fades, what are you still holding on to? And is it really yours to carry?